During those talks between the African leaders and Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kyiv yesterday, Zelensky shot down any attempt at peace without the complete withdrawal of Russian troops from his country. In the interim, Putin has increased attacks on that country. So, will the African peace mission achieve anything? Let's unpack this with Vasily Sidorov from the Institute for African Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. Thank you very much for your time this evening. And I suppose that is the big question at the moment. We're watching on as these African leaders engage the two countries on some form of peace to be declared from this war. The likelihood of this happening, given the condition that has now been put forward by the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky.
Well, I think, yes, indeed. I don't think that we are going to achieve a peace deal or a ceasefire in the near term. So certainly I don't see it happening before the NATO summit in Vilnius in 11th, 12th of July, so next month. So I don't think we will see any breakthrough after these peace talks in the coming days. Of course, on the other side, of course, this is a good peace initiative. And it's perhaps more interesting as a peace initiative in that sense than, for example, the Chinese peace initiative, because China and the Chinese government could be seen as more favoring Russia, while in terms of African mission, it could be seen as more neutral in that sense. So I think in the short run, I don't see any breakthroughs. Over time, in the future, yes, there could be some progress. Of course, on the other side, as I said, on one side, on the other side, you could say that many in the world don't see Africa seriously enough. So that could be a problem. And so the good sides, or so this. On one side, I think it's more interesting. It's better than the Chinese peace initiative in terms of its more neutrality. On the other side, it could be seen as not, African countries not being too lightweight to achieve a potential some sort of traction in terms of any future peace deal. Well, a ceasefire peace deal.
Yeah, and that's very interesting that you bring up the fact that the weight of these African countries in terms of trying to broker some kind of peace deal and the influence that they would have. Now that we know that they are in St. Petersburg to meet now with the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, what are those conversations likely to sound like? And one would assume that President Putin would remain steadfast in increasing the attacks that we've seen over the last few days in Ukraine. So what exactly can these African leaders say to the president that might get him thinking about some kind of peace deal or ceasefire?
I think on the Russian side there is an interest in some sort of peace deal or a ceasefire. So certainly there is a definite interest in negotiations on behalf of the Russian government. So at the moment we're seeing that it's with the Zelensky government that not interested in negotiations. And I think the Russian government doesn't say that they're interested in ceasefire immediately, but I don't think they will really rule that. I don't see them rejecting such an offer, in my opinion. So certainly, I think that's something that's possible. So the problem, I think, at the moment is that basically you have the current government in Ukraine that isn't interested in sort of negotiations and ceasefire, and I don't see. Basically, I see them waiting for the NATO summit to see what they can get in terms of military economic aid from the West, and then we will see what would happen. Will there be any movement towards some sort of dialogue or not?
Yeah, and I mean, that relates closely to a point that was made by President Zelensky in a press briefing, says he doesn't find the logic in these African leaders meeting with the Russian President Putin. Do you agree with those sentiments, or have they got a valid point here in terms of meeting with both presidents and not just that of Ukraine?
Well, of course, I mean, if you have a peace initiative, you have to meet with both sides, so that makes perfect sense. And I think with the case of Zelensky, he's just trying, basically saying that you shouldn't trying to isolate the Russian government. So it's very simple. I mean, I don't see, on behalf of Zelensky, in the short run, interest in negotiations and some kind of peace proposals. So, of course, the reality is it can change, in the coming, not days, but even in the coming weeks. So you never say never in that respect, of course.
So would it be possible that the Russian president, you did indicate that earlier, there might be an interest for some sort of ceasefire, that they would be able to completely stop what is happening in Ukraine while peace negotiations go on? Or are we expecting that the fighting or the attacks will continue until such time an agreement is reached? I mean, one would think it would only be fair to put a freeze on things while we try and broker a deal.
Well, I think my personal view is that I think in the end it's much easier to achieve a ceasefire agreement than fully some big major peace deal. So in that respect, I think a ceasefire is more likely than a large peace agreement. In that respect, but at the moment, I think we're seeing offensive, counter-offensive by Ukrainian army, and obviously we're looking, as I said, we're looking towards the NATO summit next month. So at the moment, it's still we're clearly not in. We're clearly, when you look at the Zelensky, when you look at Western leadership, I don't see them in the mood for some sort of, even a ceasefire deal, let alone a peace for some major peace deal.
Yeah, and then just a final thought from you. Do you have a sense of how long these talks are likely to continue on for? I think there's frustration the world over because the geopolitical events have put a lot of pressure on a global economy. So one would think that these negotiations would bear some kind of fruit, perhaps by the end of this year, if we don't see anything by the time we get to the summit.
I think, my personal view is by the end of this year, I think we will, if not see a ceasefire, then we will certainly see a major moves towards a ceasefire. I don't see the conflict continuing, obviously, for years to come. But it certainly can easily continue for several months. So till certainly can continue till October. I think President Macron said that something along the lines that we will support the French government will support Ukraine till October. So that was like a deadline, possible deadline, after which they could re-evaluate their support. So something I think that's. It's unlikely that the conflict will end certainly not in the coming days, and I don't think really in the coming weeks. So we're talking months, but obviously going forward, I don't think it will continue for that long. And obviously you have the US presidential elections coming up next year. So I think for the Biden administrations, they really have to have to achieve some sort of, at least a ceasefire deal before the elections. So in my view, that's certainly something that they have an interest in doing.
No, thank you very much for that update. That is Vasily Sidorov from the Institute for African Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences, joining us from Moscow in Russia. Let's bring you